It is September 19th, 1777. British, Hessian, and Native American forces under General Burgoyne and von Riedesel have come down from Canada and have fought and taken over Fort Ticonderoga, lost at Bennington, and Burgoyne has lost a lot of his Native American support against New York, Connecticut, and Vermont militia, as well as other New England militia. And General Kosciuszko was put in charge to set up the earthworks at a place where the Continental Army will make a stand under General Horatio Gates and the traitorous Benedict Arnold, along with Daniel Morgan. And on September 19th, one of the biggest and most important fights of the Revolutionary War will be fought with a British and Hessian attack on the soil of New York, right along the Hudson. And that battle is going to take place at no other than Saratoga, mainly on Freeman's farm. And that is where I bring you today. Now, to get a better understanding of what's been happening, General Horatio Gates was put in charge of the Northern Army with a bunch of Continental regiments, as well as a few militia regiments, both from New York and Connecticut. And these men will set up camp and set up their earthworks and everything on one side of the battlefield. And in between farmers, the British will come down the Hudson, and they'll come down Lake Champlain and take over to cut off the New England colonies. That way they can end the war. Meanwhile, September 19th, it's already been a little after the Battle of Brandywine. George Washington has lost, but saved his army. He's getting ready to go into winter quarters at Valley Forge. He's just making his way there. But we also had the Battle of Bennington, where General Stark, with a bunch of militiamen, fought off a bunch of Hessians and Native Americans. And in that loss, the Native Americans gave up ever fighting in this part of the war. And Burgoyne lost a lot of men doing so because of it. He lost a lot of his forces. And here at Saratoga, right behind me, is the overlook. Somewhere in this vicinity is Freeman's farm. And what you'll see is a very powerful stand against this professional army, against the Continental Army. This Continental Army has been fighting and holding off the British as they've retreated to try to get some ground from Ticonderoga all the way down to Fort Edward, and they're trying to stop Albany from being taken. The other goal was Howe and Clinton were to come from New York up the Hudson and help cut off. Well, Burgoyne's waiting for this reinforcements. He's not going to get it just yet. But he also needed to forage because his supply lines are getting low. That's why he sent his forces to Bennington, because he heard that there were a great amount of supplies. But Stark ended that there. But Riedesel is going to come down on the Hudson side of the river and Burgoyne's going to have his British forces come along here against Freeman's farm. Daniel Morgan's going to hold him off, and Benedict Arnold is also going to help with that as well. And there's also going to be a couple militia regiments from Connecticut that fight. No New York militia regiment fights here of militia, but the Continental Army is going to hold off at a stalemate almost. And tactically, the British win this battle, but they don't do anything to hurt the Continental Army or make them surrender, don't make them back off. But that's what we're here to talk about, is that Battle of Saratoga, a turning point in the Revolutionary War. We're going to get to that, where the battle was fought, in just a second. Now, if you don't remember, we were here last time in November when the government was shut down. So I'm actually able to drive. Made it a lot quicker instead of walking from over there, from where I came. And out in the distance, you can see the mountains. Such a beautiful sight for where such tragedy took place. And I have one such story to talk about that tragedy. But I just want to show you the view from where we're at now at the stop 1 of the Saratoga National Battlefield. But let's get to it now. So I've brought you here where the main fighting happened at Freeman's farm for the first day or the first battle of Saratoga. And what happened here is what will be considered a bloody event for General Burgoyne and his forces. Over 600 of his 6,000 troops, combined with the Hessians, are going to fall here. There will either be, there will be casualties of war, to say the least. And in some of those numbers, it's called a decimation. They will hold the field, but at that cost. I have a few books to talk about what took place here at Freeman's farm and the events that unfolded for this to happen. But we're going to get to that in a minute. Now I'm walking the path at Saratoga, and it's hard to believe this ground here. You just see the terrain. It is very hilly, rolling hills pretty much. Kind of reminds me a bit of, what is it? It's like a mix of like Antietam and even Plains of Abraham. Yeah, most people tend to believe that fighting occurs on flat land, but the terrain, that's what really makes key for most battles being fought. And where I'm looking, there's a visitor center right up there. Meanwhile, I'm looking north, and the Hudson River is going to be to my right, to the east. Back behind me here, well, that's where the Continentals and the militia are going to come up and go against Burgoyne's troops, the British. And then from the river, von Riedesel is going to make an attempt to help out and reinforce the British troops here. Now, one of the signs here, because the battle technically happened, both battles happened here, or major events happened here at the Freeman farm. And they tell you the difference between the first battle and the second battle. So here you can see where the first battle of Saratoga was fought on Freeman's farm. And the British won that fight. Make your way clockwise through Freeman's farm to first learn about the battle fought here on September 19th. The white posts you see topped with red show where the British built the log and earth walls of the massive light infantry redoubt. Near the end of the walk, you can learn how the British forces fell back here on October 7th. During the Second Battle of Saratoga, the light infantry redoubt was strong enough to repel the Americans' assault. So, these right here is, so those posts there was where the log and earth walls of the light infantry redoubt was built. And they go all along here. All along here. You could kind of make it out anyway with the terrain. So here, this signpost, it says, with his riflemen on the run, Morgan cried out, "I am ruined, by God." Major Morris ran on so rapidly with the front that they were beaten before I could get up with the rear, and my men are scattered, God knows where. General Arnold ordered Colonel Morgan's riflemen and light infantry to harass the British then marching toward this farm. When the riflemen arrived here, they drove the British back, at first. Then Brigadier General Simon Fraser's reinforcements coming in from the west outflanked Americans. Morgan's riflemen retreated in disorder. The British held the field, but this battle was only just beginning. And that looks like it took place roughly between 12:30 and 1 p.m. So probably like quarter to 1. And that took place here. Now it's hard to imagine the beauty within these mountains and these hills and this just terrain and the quietness of it. But almost 249 years ago, these hills, these mountains, suffering happened. And there are plenty of stories of tragedy that took place here. But the one story I learned about was of a Connecticut militiaman, and he will fight here on the first day battle on September 19, 1777. And he will get wounded, and eventually, sadly, he will perish from his wounds. But we're going to talk about that when we get to his monument. Now, I apologize sometimes for the sunglasses. It's quite bright here in New York. There's not even a cloud in the sky, and we're getting ready for a heat wave up here. But just a little too bright. But we come upon a monument right up here about that gentleman. And there was only 2 militia regiments that fought on September 19th, and they were both Connecticut. The New York militia, I heard, they were in reserve pretty much. And no, there's no knock against that. It's just how they were used in battle, I learned. But it was under this captain, this man was. He will suffer a terrible fate. His family will suffer terrible losses on the same day. See, as I walk along this path here that the national park has made, and I'm thankful that they kind of mowed out across because it's tick season here near the end of June, and I'm wearing pants to be safe because I've been told that the tick season here is crazy. But I learned after the national park took over here that President Roosevelt wanted to make this battlefield. Look, as close as it could be to the battle. And then the 1922 or so picture that the one ranger told me, this was all farmland with no trees. And now, thanks to President Roosevelt, about 85% of this battlefield looks like it did during famous battles of Saratoga. So it says here, the rebels fled at every charge deeper still into the woods. In the action on Freeman's farm, the 62nd Regiment charged 4 times with the national weapon, the bayonet, and furiously too. Quitting their post each time, the conflict was grievous to behold. The contest was unequal. The rebels fled at every charge deeper still into the woods, but when the British troops returned to their position, they were slowly followed. And those who had been the most forward in pursuit of the Americans in the woods were the first to fall. John Money, Burgoyne's deputy quartermaster general, and he wrote that in 1799. That took place around 4:30, and those are going to be the woods right here. I just gotta say, like, this hiking trail isn't even strenuous, but in the open is very beautiful, and the breeze feels great. It's roughly like 80 degrees out almost, and I could hardly tell with the breeze. But we're going to come up onto this monument about that captain. So here we have arrived at Captain Zebulon Bidwell. He was captain of the 4th Company, Colonel Thaddeus Cook's regiment of the Connecticut Militia. He was killed here at the Battle of Saratoga, September 19th, 1777, and was erected by Bidwell's Family Association on September 19th, 1924, almost 150 years after the battle and after he was killed. But that's not the full tragedy that happened here. I learned from the historian here about Zebulon. When he was fighting here at Freeman's farm, he was hit in the leg by a case shot. Very bad. And he was brought to the headquarters where the hospital was. And we're all aware of the medicine practices during the 18th century. Doctor amputated his leg, and sadly he will succumb to his wounds, or that one wound. Back in Connecticut, his wife was pregnant, and that same day he died, she gave birth to twins. But the tragedy of it was that they were stillborn, both twins. So on that day, not only did Mrs. Bidwell lose her husband, and she was unaware of it, she lost 2 children at once. A devastating story to know. 2 children survived of the whole time the Bidwells had children. She had multiple stillborns and miscarriages and stuff like that, and out of all of them, 2 survived, and they were the ones whose kin would erect this monument here. And for Zebulon, that's where his story ends. But in 1924, they did erect this monument to him. And that's it. That's still a tragedy. He didn't get to see his children grow up. He couldn't be there to comfort his wife and go through those emotions with her. She had to do it all alone. I don't think she remarried or did anything after that. But that's just probably one of the bigger tragedies in hindsight of this battle that took place here. And I wanted to bring you to the monument here to tell his story as I learned it. But now let's get on to the books. Okay, so before we go back, it says here that the Germans arrived to save the day. Because we just have to look at signposts. It says by the evening, the battle was going badly for General Burgoyne. He ordered his German troops to march up from near the Hudson River. They arrived at Freeman's farm just as the Americans' fire was more galling than it ever had been. They reinforced the weakening British line. Major General Frederick von Riedesel, well, the Von's usually in there, came with more than 700 German troops and 2 cannons to help the British win. German infantrymen went into the woods. They used trees for cover so they could attack and dislodge the enemy without great loss. The Americans were no match for this unexpected attack. Overwhelmed, they retreated. That was at 6:30. But here at 5:30, it says, the battle favors the Americans. And I heard that Enoch Poor was also an overlooked officer general of this battle. It says here, Brigadier General Enoch Poor's brigade drove the British out of the woods. The American troops made bolder attacks into the open field. The British fell back further, leaving behind 2 valuable cannons. Continentals tried to haul those guns off the field. These proved to be too heavy to move without horses. Men and boys fought hand to hand to take back the guns. A detachment of Massachusetts Continental troops were ordered to make a rapid advance and charge with the bayonet. The enemy immediately retreated in confusion. We pursued, and the field was literally covered with the dead and wounded. And that's what is depicted here. Now, as I said about terrain, look at the height in which those plaques were and Zebulon Bidwell's monument is. And this is the terrain that the Continentals, the British, and the Hessians all had to deal with, and the militiamen. So, to think about this struggle, either way, whoever won this part of the battle, or even just fought here, had to have been just determined. As I come up on this plaque, hundreds killed and buried here. The battle was over. The British won. The toll was staggering. The Americans lost 300 killed and wounded, while the British lost 550. Hospitals were overflowing, and the British worked day and night to bury the bodies of the fallen in this very field. And it makes me wonder if there's still British and American dead within this field. Not everybody gets out. But Lieutenant Hervey of the 62nd, a youth of 16, received several wounds and was repeatedly ordered off the field, but his heroic ardor would not allow him to quit the battle, or I would say quit, where he could stand and see his brave lads fighting beside him. Ball striking one of his legs, his removal became absolutely necessary, and while they were conveying him away, another wounded him mortally. Ensign Thomas Anbury, 24th Regiment of Foot, 1789. That happened at 7 p.m. I believe Mrs. von Riedesel spoke about that 16-year-old boy, or I should say man, 'cause it takes a lot of guts and courage to fight. I believe he was brought into her house where she was staying, just not too far from the battlefield. And sadly, I believe, that, as it says, he was mortally wounded. He perished right in her in that parlor area wherever they had him. I believe. Don't hold me to it. I remember reading something about that in Frederick Bear's uh, book Hessians, because some of the wounded were brought to where she was at um, from the battle, both battles actually, but still, where she stayed, I remember her saying she could hear the cries and the moans of the wounded and the dying in that book. So even those who didn't see battle saw the aftermath. War is tragedy all around. Even civilians suffer, or those who weren't even fighting suffer. And that's one story to say about it. I have with me here Battle Maps of the American Revolution by the American Battlefield Trust. And it says here on page 60 about the Battle of Saratoga, Freeman's Farm, September 19th, 1777. It says, in the fall of 1777, the wheels began to come off of John Burgoyne's northern campaign. Early victories at Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Anne, and Hubbardton gave way to defeat at Fort Stanwix and Bennington. The British strategy called for a three-pronged attack coordinated by three separate British armies converging on Albany, New York. The force moving from Lake Ontario and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger had besieged Fort Stanwix but could not crack its defense. A push up the Hudson River by Sir General Henry Clinton fuzzed out due to Clinton's lack of aggression. Burgoyne's main force, moving south from Canada, came the closest to reaching its goal. But American resistance and supply problems plagued the 7,500-man force headed by Burgoyne himself. By mid-September, Burgoyne's army reached the northern outskirts of the small village of Saratoga. The Americans had problems of their own, namely dysfunction at their highest command levels. General Philip Schuyler commanded the northern department, but he was disliked by the New England militiamen, and a faction in Congress wanted to replace him. General Horatio Gates, a former British officer turned patriot, commanded the northern department for a time before being replaced by Schuyler. And then Schuyler was once again replaced by Gates. This turnstile command structure hampered early efforts to slow Burgoyne, and it contributed to the loss of Fort Ticonderoga. On September 19th, Burgoyne divided his army into three columns. He wanted to use each column to probe American defenses. Morgan's Virginians engaged with the center column on September 19th near the farm of loyalist John Freeman, which is where we are at right now. It was a hotly contested fight. Gates reinforced Morgan, and a seesaw action occurred throughout the afternoon. Patriots captured British cannon only to have them retaken by the enemy. Morgan and Arnold led counterattacks as American riflemen wreaked havoc on the Tory officer corps. By evening, the British held the field, but the action had blunted their forward motion. Hoping to be reinforced by Clinton from New York City, Burgoyne chose to dig in and wait out the Americans until help arrived. Help arrived, but for the rebels rather than the British. And this is all because on August 4th, 1777, Gates assumed command of the Northern Department. He was supported by two capable subordinates, the traitorous General Benedict Arnold and Colonel Daniel Morgan, leader of a storied Virginia Rifle Regiment. Gates' army numbered some 8,500 men, and to disrupt the British advance south, the American commander ordered his men to erect defenses on the crest of Bemis Heights, which was part of a series of bluffs from which both the Hudson River and the paralleling road could be seen. From there, American artillery had the range to hit both the river and the road. In order to attack, the British would have to use the road because the forest and vegetation to the east were too dense to permit effective troop movements. The Americans erected fortifications that extended out about 3/4 of a mile, creating a line shaped like a large L. 22 cannons were emplaced along the line, providing the Americans with ample artillery cover. Now, as we see here at Freeman's farm, we have Enoch Poor and Daniel Morgan. They're here with the 3rd New Hampshire, 2nd New Hampshire, 1st New Hampshire, and Morgan's riflemen. These are all Continental troops, by the way, along with Morgan's rifles and the light regiment And then Enoch Poor and Arnold and Learned, they would all come and help, and troops estimated 8,000 against Burgoyne's 8,500. Now, when we talked about Bidwell and the Connecticut regiments of militia, the Connecticut militia were the 3rd highest rated of casualties under the 1st New Hampshire and that light infantry regiment. So underneath those two, they suffered the 3rd most casualties on September 19th. 350-ish casualties throughout the whole day for the Americans, while the British lost 600 out of the 6,000 troops that Burgoyne had. Burgoyne also had the Hessians, so that was a mistake I will fix right now. So in total, it was 8,500 troops, but Morgan lost 600 of his 6,000 British. So we have all of them fighting against the 21st, 62nd, and Haddon's 2 guns, and the 20th Regiment, all right here in this vicinity. Meanwhile, von Riedesel came with 4 guns, and his troops help hold the ground here. And I have other books that'll help discuss what actually took place here in just a second. I have with me here The Battle of Saratoga by Rupert Furneux. And on page 171, it says, in the action on September 19th, the British center column was engaged by the American left division, and the fighting occupied 3 phases. Simon Fraser's column played little part in the action, and von Riedesel became engaged late in the day when, by his speedy arrival at the scene of the conflict, he staved off a British defeat. As is true of the whole campaign, we are told far more by the British diarists and generals than by their American counterparts, who, when they wrote at all, confined their remarks to the most general statements. The British and German writers described both what they saw for themselves and what they were told by others, frequently without reference to times or places. The action, which lasted until nightfall, became a confused struggle which, except on Freeman's clearing, took place in dense woods and on ground which the Marquis de Chasteleux, one of the Comte de Rochambeau's officers, found in 1780 to be so intersected and covered that it is impossible either to conceive or to discover the smallest resemblance between it and the plans given to the public by General Burgoyne. From the British center column, which, having crossed the great ravine, had halted on the edge of Freeman's clearing, a picket commanded by Major Forbes was sent to reconnoiter the cabin. There he was attacked, in his own words, with great vigor from behind railed fences by Morgan's riflemen, who about the same time came into contact with Canadians of Simon Fraser's column. And the Americans' aimed rifle fire was so deadly that every officer of the picket, Forbes included, and many of his men were instantly killed or wounded. The survivors fled, pursued eagerly by the riflemen, who, overrunning the clearing, came face to face with the main body of British center column. They scattered and retreated across the clearing to take shelter in the woods, where they were discovered by Colonel Wilkinson, who, despite Gates' orders, had found an excuse to go forward in search of intelligence. I put spurs to my horse, and directed the sound, had entered the wood about 100 rods, when the fire suddenly ceased. I, however, pursued my course, and the first officer I fell in with was Major Dearborn, who, with great animation and not a little warmth, was forming 30 or 40 file of his infantry. I exchanged a few words with him, passed on, and met Major Morris alone, who was never so sprightly as under a hot fire. From him I learned that the corps was advancing by files in 2 lines, when they unexpectedly fell upon a picket of the enemy, which they almost instantly forced, and pursuing the fugitives, their front had as unexpectedly fallen in with the British line. That several officers and men had been made prisoners, and that to save himself he had been obliged to push his horse through the ranks of the enemy, and escaped by a circuitous route. To show me where the action commenced, he leaped a fence into the abandoned field of Freeman, choked up with weeds, and led me to the cabin which had been occupied by the British picket, but was then almost encircled with dead. He then cautioned me to look out for the enemy, who he observed could not be far from us, and as I never admired exposition from neither advantage nor honor could be derived, I crossed the angle of the field, leapt the fence, and just before me on a ridge discovered Lieutenant Colonel Butler with 3 men all treed. From him I learned that they had caught a Scotch prize, that having forced the picket they had closed with the British line and been instantly routed, and from the suddenness of the shock and the nature of the ground, were broken and scattered in all directions. He repeated Morris's caution to me, and remarked that enemy sharpshooters were on the opposite side of the ravine, and that being on horseback I should attract a shot. We changed our position, and the colonel inquired what were Morgan's orders, and informed me that he had seen a heavy column moving towards our left. I then turned about to regain the camp and report to the general, when my ears were saluted by an uncommon noise, which I approached, and perceived Colonel Morgan, attended by 2 men only, who, with a turkey call, was collecting his dispersed troops. The moment I came up to him, he burst into tears, and exclaimed, "I am ruined, by God!" Major Morris ran on so rapidly with the front that they were beaten before I could end up with the rear, and my men are scattered God knows where. I remarked to the colonel that he had a long day before him to retrieve an inauspicious beginning, and informed him where I had seen his field officers, which appeared to cheer him, and we parted. Probably before phase 2 of the action in the center began, or possibly synchronizing with it, Morgan and Dearborn's men clashed with Simon Fraser's column, which had taken position on rising ground to the westward of Freeman's farm, from where it was concealed by the dense woods. For this action we relied on Lieutenant Anbury, who joined the advance of the 24th Regiment, which Fraser had sent to cover Major Forbes' retreat. A batman of General Fraser's rescued from the Indians an officer of the Americans, one Captain Van Swearingham, of Colonel Morgan's Virginia riflemen. They were on the point of stripping him, which the man prevented, and recovered his pocketbook from him, containing all his papers of consequence and his commission. He offered the soldier all his paper dollars, and lamented that he had no hard ones to reward him with. The batman brought him up to General Fraser, when he interrogated him concerning the enemy, but could obtain no other answer that their army was commanded by General Gates and Arnold. General Fraser, exceedingly provoked that he could gain no intelligence, told him that if he did not immediately inform him as to the exact situation of the enemy, he would hang him up directly. The officer, with the most undaunted firmness, replied, "You may, if you please." The general, perceiving he could make nothing of him, rode off, leaving him in custody of Lieutenant Dunbar of the artillery. My servant, just as at this period, arrived with my canteen, which was rather fortunate, as we stood in need of some refreshment after our march through the woods and this little skirmish. I requested Dunbar with his prisoner to partake of it, and sitting upon a tree, we asked this captain a variety of questions, to which he always gave evasive answers, and we both observed that he was in great spirits. At last I said to him, "Captain, do you think we shall have any more work upon our hands today?" To which he replied, "Yes, yes, you'll have business enough, for there are many hundreds all round you now." He had hardly spoken the words, then from a wood a little way in our front came an excessive heavy fire. Dunbar ran to his gun, saying, "Anbury, you must take charge of the captain." There being only one officer besides myself with the company, I committed him to the custody of a sergeant, to convey him to the house where the rest of the prisoners were, with particular orders, as the general had desired, that he should not be ill treated. I then hastened to my company, on joining of which I met a number of men who were retiring wounded, and at this time the firing of the enemy was suppressed by the artillery. So a lot of chaos had happened in that bit of time, but that's not the end of it. Now it says here on page 181, it says the battle across and around the clearing swayed to and fro for several hours. That night, Colonel Dearborn noted in his diary, "On this day has been fought one of the greatest battles that ever was fought in America, and I trust we have convinced the British butchers that the cowardly Yankees can, and when there is a call for it, will fight." General Glover, on the other hand, found both sides equally courageous. Both armies seemed determined to conquer or die. One continual blaze without any intermission till dark, when by consent when when by consent of both parties it ceased, during which time we several times drove them, took the ground, passing over great numbers of their dead and wounded, took one field prize, but the woods and brush were so thick, and being close pushed by another party of the enemy coming up, was obliged to give up our prize. The enemy in turn sometimes drove us. They were bold, intrepid, and fought like heroes, and I do assure you, sirs, our men were equally bold and courageous, and fought like men fighting for their all. On page 186 it says, "Thus had General Riedesel," says the general himself, "with his German troops once more saved the English from a great misfortune, having unquestionably decided the engagement in their favor. Notwithstanding, however, the praise which the German troops received for their bravery on this occasion, General Burgoyne and a few other English commanders regarded the German general with secret envy. Indeed, they would gladly have passed over his merits, had such a thing been possible. British pride did not desire the acknowledgment of bravery other than their own, as we shall see more plainly in the future. The day had been saved. During the night," says Lieutenant Digby, "we remained in our ranks, and though we heard the groans of our wounded and dying at a small distance, yet could not assist them till morning, not knowing the position of the enemy, and expecting the action would be renewed at daybreak. Sleep was a stranger to us, but we were all in good spirits, and ready to obey with cheerfulness any orders the general might issue before moving dawned." The British casualties had been severe. Burgoyne had lost a third of his force and had gained nothing. Of the 62nd Regiment, only 60 men remained standing. In his returns, Major Kingston noted the killed, wounded, and missing as 556, including 2 lieutenant colonels, 3 majors, 9 captains, 14 lieutenants, 7 ensigns, 26 sergeants, 6 drummers, and 489 rank and file. The high proportion of officers killed and wounded was attributed by Anbury to the great execution of Morgan's riflemen, who directed their fire against them in particular. In every interval of smoke they were sure to take off some, as the riflemen had posted themselves in high trees. The dead were buried in deep pits on the field of battle, and though sought by the National Park Service, they have never been located. Anbury describes his experiences as a command of the burial party. "The day after our late engagement, I had as unpleasant a duty as can fall to the lot of an officer. The command of the party sent out to bury the dead and bring in the wounded, and as we encamped on the spot where the 3 British regiments had been engaged, there were very numerous. I, however, observed a little more decency than some parties had done, who left heads, legs, and arms above ground. No other distinction is paid to officer or soldier than that the officers are put in a hole by themselves. Our army abounded with young officers in the subaltern line, and in the course of this unpleasant duty, 3 of the 20th Regiment were interred together, the age of the eldest not exceeding 17. This friendly office to the dead, though it greatly affects the feelings, was nothing to the scene in bringing in the wounded. The one were past all pain, the other in the most excruciating torments, sending forth dreadful groans. They had remained out all night, and from the loss of blood and want of nourishment were upon the point of expiring with faintness. Some of them begged they might lie and die. Others again were insensible. Some upon the least movement were put in the most horrid tortures, and all had near a mile to be conveyed to the hospitals. Others at their last gasp, who for want of our timely assistance must have inevitably expired. These poor creatures, perishing with cold and weltering in their blood, displayed such a scene. It must be a heart of adamant that could not be affected at it, even to a degree of weakness. That's just the tragedy of the British on that end. For most of the part, on September 1977, medieval and modern methods of warfare had clashed for the first time, and it took Europeans more than a century to perceive the advantages of method of fighting that the Americans had learned in their frontier wars against the Red Indians. As we now say Native Americans, this book is slightly dated. But the way the British fought against the way the Americans fought were completely different. British are used to fighting in a field, while the Americans took up the tactics of the Native Americans and blended them with uh, professional fighting, I would say. So the reason why that happened is because of the way with the casualties was by way of how the Americans fought here and how they didn't necessarily strategically win the battle, but they decimated the casualties of Burgoyne's forces. I have with me here a Battlefield Atlas of the American Revolution by Craig L. Symonds. And it says here on page 47 about the battle at Freeman's Farm. It says, 3 days after Stark's victory at Bennington, Congress named Horatio Gates to supersede Philip Schuyler in command of the Northern Army, in yet another episode of the feud between New England and New York officers. We learned that. So that is that we've already read about that. But it says Gates' position was a strong one. His army occupied a high bluff overlooking the Hudson River near Bemis Tavern, where the Polish engineer Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko had laid out strong entrenchments. I'm sorry if I butchered his name. It's hard for me to try to say it properly. I apologize. On the right, Gates placed the brigades of Glover, Nixon, and Patterson, about 3,000 men, and the bulk of his artillery. A little to the west, near a farmhouse belonging to a Mr. Nielsen, Gates placed his center under Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned, and established his own headquarters. On his western or left flank, Gates placed Benedict Arnold with several New England regiments and the riflemen of Daniel Morgan. It was a strong position, but not unassailable. If the British could get around Arnold's flank, they could seize higher ground to the west and use their artillery to force the Americans out of their fortifications, as they had at Fort Ticonderoga. For that reason, Arnold urged Gates to assail Burgoyne's approaching during his approach, but Gates rejected Arnold's advice and awaited a British attack. During his confrontation with Gates' army, Burgoyne was literally groping in the dark. The area was so thickly wooded and the terrain so uneven. Yeah, as I've shown in the video leading up to Freeman's Farm, that Burgoyne had no clear picture of the American position. Nevertheless, at 10 a.m. on September 19th, Burgoyne began a tentative advance, sending his men forward in 3 divisions through the thick forest of mixed pine and hardwoods. Arnold begged Gates for permission to strike them, and finally Gates agreed to send Morgan's riflemen forward and told Arnold that he could involve the rest of his command if the situation justified it. Around midday, the center corps of Brigadier General John Hamilton, accompanied by Burgoyne himself, came under fire from the woods around the clearing at Freeman's Farm. Concentrating on the officers and the gunners, Morgan's men picked off the redcoats one by one until the frustrated British mounted a charge. Arnold brought his regiments forward, and a general engagement ensued. The British forces were soon in serious trouble. Arnold sent word back to Gates that a few reinforcements he could defeat the British altogether. But Gates not only refused to budge, he ordered Arnold back to the American lines, orders which Arnold ignored. For the British, the situation was saved by Riedesel, who marched his men toward the sound of the guns and managed to drive off Arnold's impetuous attacks. Riedesel's initiative prevented what might have turned into a full-scale disaster for the British. Even as it was, though the British held the field, at nightfall they had suffered terrible casualties. Some 600 British, many of them officers, had fallen to the American marksmen, while the Americans had suffered fewer than 300 casualties. In addition, the fighting spirit of many Burgoyne's veterans had been shaken by the character of the wilderness battle. Moreover, they knew that Gates' army still lay across their intended line of advance. Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of it. Still hard to believe it. I mean, I'm glad this book says how uneven this terrain is, because taking a look around, it's beautiful. But at the time of the battle, shots fired all across here. It's unimaginable for us to really dive into how chaotic it was, and this whole area was nothing but chaos. And men persevered, men fell, men retreated. That's what happens in battle, and sadly, men will die. That's the biggest tragedy of the war. But we have one more book to talk about the battle. I have with me here The Glorious Cause, the American Revolution, 1763 to 1789, by Robert Middlekauff. It says here on page 385 that the battle began at 10 o'clock a.m. with cannon firing the signal to start the advance. This coordinated opening marked just about the only coordination Burgoyne's forces attained that day. The right wing under Fraser contained 10 companies of light infantry and 10 of grenadiers, Brunswick riflemen of company size, 7 artillery pieces, a few Tories, and the battalion of the 24th Regiment. Altogether, they numbered around 2,000 men. Hamilton led a center composed of 1,100 men, 4 regiments, and 6 light field pieces. General Riedesel and Phillips, with about the same number, were on the right, with 3 Brunswick regiments and 8 field pieces. When the cannon fire set these 3 wings in motion, the Americans were sitting behind their breastworks. Continentals on the right, overlooking the river with Gates in charge. Massachusetts and New York Continentals under Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned at the center, and a mixture of militia and regulars on the left under Arnold. Gates did not respond when told of the British movement toward his position. Arnold did, urging his chief to send a force out to meet the enemy as to avoid being battered and trapped within the breastworks on the heights. Sitting still, the Americans were vulnerable, Arnold argued. On the move in the woods, they would deprive Burgoyne of the advantage of his artillery gave him. Gates remained unmoved by this argument for almost 3 hours, though his scouts perched high in the trees kept him informed of the flash and glitter of the advancing redcoats with their bayonets unsheathed. Around noon, Gates gave way to Arnold's argument and sent Colonel Daniel Morgan and his Virginia riflemen toward the forward on the left. Morgan soon followed by Henry Dearborn's light infantry, and then much of the Arnold's force met the British center near Freeman's farm, about a mile north of Bemis Heights. There, in a clearing about 350 yards long, the battle was fought. For most of the afternoon until darkness, the central wing of Burgoyne's army under General Hamilton's command held the north edge of this clearing. The Americans under Arnold maintained a rough line along the southern fringe. There is no way of establishing how many times the two sides surged across the open space and into an enemy's woods. Hamilton's regulars apparently first attempted to rely on the bayonet, perhaps expecting that Morgan's men and the others would run rather than stand. But stand they did, and the long rifles cut down red-coated infantry before the heavy mass could lose. Neither Arnold nor Morgan believed in this static defense or in absorbing blows before delivering them. Arnold, in particular, loved the assault, and he led his troops over the clearing into the British line. The American charge swept the British regulars back and drove artillerymen from their guns, but the British returned under officers fully as brave as Arnold and Morgan. By late afternoon, with the bodies stacked up in the clearing in the woods, British volleys began to lose their power. The troops under Hamilton had taken terrible losses, and they had probably begun the battle slightly outnumbered. The 62nd, in particular, received extraordinarily heavy American fire, with the result at the end of the day of its 350 men, only 60 remained. British officers who'd fought in Europe in the 7 Years' War remarked later that they had never experienced heavier fire. Burgoyne was with them, and his bravery undoubtedly helped keep spirits up. But Fraser had not been able to enter the battle. He, in fact, still struggled to find his way to the high ground in the west. Not until the center was about to collapse did Riedesel's troops force their way up the bluff from the river. Their coming prevented the disintegration of Hamilton's command, and as darkness fell, it was Arnold's men, not their enemies, who fell back. The British held the field at Freeman's farm, but they had taken casualties they could not replace. In all, 556 British regulars died or wounded. Casualties, pretty much. Arnold believed that he might have completely destroyed the enemy that day had Gates acceded to his plea for reinforcements while the battle went on. Gates did not commit reinforcements, however. He, like his enemy, had not brought concentrated power to bear. Burgoyne had not, because of his initial dispositions. 3 separate, indeed isolated commands, groping in a maze of green woods, ravines, and steep slopes. Gates had, for not reasons known only to himself, undoubtedly what seems to be clear today, that a side that successfully concentrated its forces would vanquish the other, seemed only obscure in the September sunlight. Gates may have had a clear idea of where his enemy was than Burgoyne had, but he could not be certain that those 3 forces would not succeed in pinching in on Bemis Heights. A more perceptive man might have grasped the disadvantages that Burgoyne had imposed upon himself, and a bolder one surely would have poured his men into the center. If Hamilton could have been broken, Riedesel stumbling through ravines along the river's edge would have been isolated and vulnerable. As it was, both sides absorbed heavy losses, but Gates could replace his, whereas Burgoyne could not. And they were separated by a mile of one another because Bemis Heights is not far from this location. And the fighting will end on September 19th. And then it wouldn't be till October 7th for the next battle of Saratoga. So, Burgoyne is going to suffer all those casualties, decimated. And the reason why we say decimated is because 10% of the force was lost. So, that's why we say decimated. 350 Continentals became casualties. Now, Gates can replace those casualties while Burgoyne can, because he's so far south from Canada. I mean, he's nowhere near reinforcements from Clinton. And St. Leger was defeated and decided to back away from Fort Stanwix. So this whole plan slowly is unraveling. And the loss at Bennington didn't help either. So Burgoyne doesn't have much left to give for this fight and for this campaign. And he's got pretty much like almost a last-ditch effort to remove Gates from Bemis Heights. And it's going to be on everything for him to get this going. Now, thanks to von Riedesel, he was able to help save the day and keep the casualties low. And complete disaster. It's not going to be until October 7th when the final battle of Saratoga takes place. Now, there's going to be some other actions throughout to figure out where the lines are, but they know very well who they're up against. And Gates and Arnold, they're still going to argue. They're still going to butt heads. But the battle that comes will be the tell-all. But on that fateful September 19th day, the Americans are feeling very confident. They're rallied. They're good to go pretty much. And it's within these woods here where they fought. This is still hard to think, like as somebody who loves history and appreciates what happened, still hard to imagine the carnage, what's going through people's minds, the soldiers' minds who fought here, struggled here, died here, survived. It all happened on this battlefield on that September day. A lot of history in America happened in September, be it good or bad. This is one of the good ones. Even though British tactically won or strategically won, it was the Americans who started to put that little thought of moral deterioration or morale, the deterioration of morale in the British and Hessian forces. As the Americans, be it militia and Continental, who gave their all here to keep the American cause alive, especially after George Washington loses in Brandywine. And to think of Mrs. Bidwell, the loss of her husband, she'll find out later, and the loss of her twins. It's hard to imagine just everything happening here, but it did. And we have historical records that conclude it and help give light to it. And we have books that tell it in a better story for us to understand. And I'm glad to have finally been able to come back and talk about Saratoga the way I wanted to instead of the first time. And I hope you enjoyed this story and this video. And if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next. Have a good one.